And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the powers of death shall not prevail against it. Which rock is this rock? Christdefender, silly Christdefender. Haven't you read the Greek, you idiot? Peter's name is Petros, and that means small stone, like a pebble. But Jesus said that he would build his church on a rock, Petra. Silly, silly Christdefender. What are we going to do with you, eh? Let's explore some possible reasons Matthew uses two different Greek words here. Let's also explore whether these are in fact different Greek words. How about that? Before we do that, let's consider the typical Protestant interpretation of the text. You know, the one that denies the papacy. That is, by the use of two different Greek words, Matthew means to refer to two different things. That Petros, which means small stone or pebble, refers to Peter, and Petra, which means big rock, and refers either to Jesus or to Peter's confession of faith, or maybe both. Now, this distinction is either arbitrary or it serves to contrast the two images, a small stone and a rock. Though the more I've thought about it, even if we interpret this as a contrast between a small stone and a large rock, it still seems arbitrary considering the immediate context. Anyway, the latter interpretation, the contrasting images, assumes a literary device called antithetic parallelism. Now, you don't need to know what that is. I'm just telling you what it's called. Forget about it. And if you don't want to forget about it, write it down. Otherwise, you'll forget about it. Antithetic parallelism is a literary device that is often found in Hebrew poetry, like in Psalm 34, verse 10. The young lions lack and suffer hunger, but those who seek the Lord shall not lack any good thing. Do you see that there are two contrasting ideas placed side by side to highlight their differences? The contrast between lack and abundance reinforces the message of the psalm. This form of parallelism is commonly marked by the conjunction but, which helps emphasize the opposing ideas. So, Matthew 16:18, assuming this literary device, might read something like, "You are a small stone, but on this other big rock I will build my church." Here's the problem. Why should we assume this literary device? It could just as well be synthetic parallelism. That is, when the second idea builds on the first rather than contrasts it. So, assuming this literary device, we would read something like, "Though you appear to be a small stone, on the big rock you really are, I will build my church." Understand that I am not saying it is synthetic parallelism. I'm only pointing out that it's just as likely. And perhaps that it would even be more reasonable to assume this literary device considering the immediate context. But let's look at 4 possible answers to the question, why does Matthew use 2 different words? Why are we doing this? Well, if there are plausible interpretations of Matthew 16:18 that do not involve denying the papacy necessarily, then we open up the possibility for the Protestant to the papacy. Make sense? These 2 words, Petros and Petra, were synonymous in 1st century Greek. The difference in meaning can be found in Attic Greek. The New Testament, however, was written in Koine Greek. Attic and Koine Greek are 2 distinct stages of the Greek language. Attic Greek was spoken during the classical period. Koine Greek emerged after, a few centuries before Christ, and became the common language of the Hellenistic world. And the Hellenistic Jewish scholars who gave us the Septuagint, that's the Greek version of the Old Testament. In Koine Greek, both Petros and Petra simply mean rock. Now, if Jesus wanted to call Simon a small stone, the Greek word lithos would have been used instead, which can refer to a stone of almost any size. Moreover, let's not forget the underlying Aramaic. Most probably, kepha was used in both clauses, and so we would read, "You are kepha, and on this kepha I will build my church," since in Aramaic, kepha was used both for a name and for a rock. The Aramaic is another crucial detail that I'll go into later. The Peshitta, that's the standard Syriac version of the Bible, used by Syrian Christian churches and translated from Hebrew and Greek between the 2nd and 5th centuries into Syriac, also makes no distinction between the words in the two clauses. Now, I'm aware that none of that answers our question. If you were paying attention, you would have realized that too. Were you? The reason I talk about it though is that it's background information we need to understand. As for the Greek then, why does the Greek make a distinction between Petros and Petra? Well, possibility numero uno is that using Petros and Petra, as opposed to using Petros and Petros or Petra and Petra, serves to preserve the wordplay, the rhetorical force of Jesus's saying here, the pun. The pun being Simon's new name, which literally means rock, and the so-called rock that the church will be built on. As well, Petra could not very well serve as a masculine name. So the maleness of Peter provides grounds for why Petros is used in the first instance. The two words differ in gender. It would have been unthinkable to use a Greek feminine noun for the proper name of a man. So then, it's possible, for our first potential reason, that Matthew uses the two different forms of the Greek word for rock to preserve Jesus's pun and Peter's maleness. A second possibility is familiarity. What would Matthew's audience be familiar with? How would they have understood his words? We are not his primary audience. Remember that. Petros, the masculine noun, occurs infrequently in classical poetic Greek to mean a stone, i.e. a broken piece of rock, though the distinction from Petra is not consistently observed. But Petros as a common noun is unlikely to have been familiar to Matthew's readers, as it is not found in the Septuagint except for twice in 2nd Maccabees, nor is it found in the New Testament and in related literature. Meaning, are you taking notes? Petra, in comparison to Petros, was the more familiar term to Matthew's audience for rock. And since the word is being used as a metaphor and not for a proper masculine name as it was in the first instance, Petra would have been the natural word for Matthew to use rather than repeating his use of Petros. Okay. A third possibility, my favorite, grammar, specifically sentence structure. It's my jam. The definition of Petra is rock. Petra means a rock, ledge, cliff, cave, stony ground. That's according to Bible Hub. Basically a mass of rock. In the Matthew 16:18 text, there is no definite article preceding Petra. It is not the rock, as it is earlier in Matthew's Gospel, which illustrates Jesus's enduring nature and the secure foundation he alone provides. Instead, there is a demonstrative pronoun, the word this. Hence, the verse reads, "This rock," not "the rock." So, which rock is this rock? Welp, this must refer to Peter. Jesus changes Simon's name to Peter. That's what's immediately just happened. And Peter, Petros, literally means rock. If Jesus speaks of a rock in the first part of the sentence, and then in the second part of that same sentence speaks of this rock, then it is more than reasonable to conclude that this rock refers to the same rock spoken of in the first part of the sentence, namely Peter, Petros. Like, for example, in Matthew 21, 42 to 44, Jesus says, "The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him." Ouch. Would you argue that this stone in verse 44 refers to some other stone? If Jesus speaks of a stone in verse 42 and then speaks of this stone in verse 44, the natural conclusion is that this stone in verse 44 refers back to the same stone in verse 42. Same line of reasoning applies to Matthew 16:18. To suggest otherwise would undermine both the plain meaning of the text and the rhetorical force of Jesus's saying. The last possibility I'll mention is, again, the Aramaic. Some Aramaic is preserved for us in the Gospels. For instance, Jesus' cry in Matthew 27:46. Also, 4 times in Galatians and in 1 Corinthians, we have the Aramaic form of Simon's new name. In our English Bibles, it's Cephas. That's a transliteration of the Aramaic Kepha. Again, Kepha doesn't mean little stone or pebble. It means rock, same as Petra. The Aramaic reveals that Jesus was equating Simon and the rock, not contrasting them. This all ought to matter to those who insist that Peter has nothing to do with the structure of the church that Jesus said he would build. Jesus is so very clearly telling us otherwise. And these possible explanations for the Greek mean the Catholic interpretation is not unbiblical. It is quite reasonable, and I would obviously argue true. Come on, non-Catholics, stop this nonsense. What are you even protesting anymore? Get with it, come home, alright?